About 2 years ago, I planted a pomegranate tree in my backyard. And honestly, it's been doing great until this happened. Yep, frost damage. It hit. And you know, I haven't had this problem before with pomegranate trees because they are among the later trees to leaf out in the spring. I have a lot of stone fruit trees. Those are always the first ones to go, and they're the ones that I'm always keeping an eye out for frost damage. So when this happened, I was a little surprised and annoyed because this is a 2-year-old tree. Just to kind of give you a little bit of background and context, I planted it 2 springs ago. It grew really well its first year, and I gave it a pretty hard pruning its first winter. And I did a video on that. I'll link to it below. And that was all about establishing a good shape and getting the tree off to a good start. And as a result of that, it grew beautifully last year. I've been so happy with the overall shape and form. And that meant that this year I had to do very little pruning at all, just enough to kind of open it up and just kind of get a few things out of the way. And so because of that, this was the year I was looking forward to fruit for the first time on this tree. Because what you need to know about pomegranates and their fruiting is that while they do tend to grow blossoms at the end of new growth, that new growth comes off of branches that are a few years old, at least 1 year old, if not more. So to take you back just a few weeks ago, my typical last frost date where I live is around the middle of March, maybe into the 3rd week of March. Well, about a week ago, which would have been right on the edge of that average last frost date, we did indeed get a frost, but it was a particularly hard frost for this time of year. And this is the result of that. Just a couple weeks before, I'd noticed the tree starting to bud and leaf out, and I could see the new growth beginning. It was looking great. And that's another thing to know about pomegranate trees. Since they are, typically gonna come out of dormancy sometime in the mid-spring, you might have less problems with late frost than other trees, except for the fact that they are particularly susceptible to frost damage like right now, when the buds are starting to break and the very beginning of new growth is happening. And that is what happened with this tree. It was just beginning to grow at the perfect window of time for that late frost to come. And so you can see really clearly, I'm so glad I can demonstrate for you what happens to a pomegranate tree when it experiences a late frost in the very early stages of growth. So let me bring you a little bit closer so I can show you what things look like. I can show you what's dead, what's still alive, and in a minute, what I'm gonna do about it. Here you can see very clearly what part of the tree is still alive and thriving, and then compare that to some of the center of the tree. And I can tell that most of this is actually dead. And let me show you how I know that. So the stuff that is still alive, you can see, even though this branch is pretty bare, you can see further down that there is growth starting to come out. So I'm gonna leave this one alone for now and see how it does. Maybe part of the branch will die. Maybe I'll have to cut back some of it. We'll see, but I have enough information to see that, I need to just leave it be for now and let it try to recover. However, right next door, this branch right here, I can tell is dead. For one thing, there is not a single sign of growth on it. For another thing, and this is the big one, you can see right as we get down here close to this little branch crotch, some signs of actual sun scald and frost damage on the bark. So this cracking, this sort of discoloration and cracking was not here earlier in the winter. And that makes sense because this branch is one of the ones that I would say is like the most sun exposed. It's pointed basically directly south. And what happens is when we get the wide fluctuations of winter temperatures, especially where I live, look, you can see down here, it's even worse. It just looks terrible. It's cracked. It's so clearly damaged. But the bright sun warms up the bark during the day, and then when there's a sudden shift of temperature and it drops at night, especially during a frost event like we had, then the tissue of the bark just shrinks and expands really rapidly, and that causes it to crack, and that just weakens the tree overall. And in this case, it killed this whole branch. So let's look over here now. What about over here? It's a little unclear. I don't see those signs of frost damage, but I also don't see any signs of life. So let me show you another trick to see if something is alive or dead. So here I've got my sharp sanitized grafting knife. I'm going to try to do this carefully one-handed. But to check if something is alive, if you just scrape off a little bit of the outer bark and look underneath. Let's see if I can get it to focus. Come on. Yeah, right there. You can see how brown that is. That's a sign that this branch is dead. Let me take you over to this branch that I know is dead. This is my frost damaged branch. So if we do the same thing here on this branch, scrape away a bit of the bark, look underneath, see how brown and dead that is. Now let me contrast that over here. Let's hop on over to one of these very much alive branches, and let me do the same. Just scrape a thin layer and look what we have. Bright green, very clearly alive. So now what? What do I do now that my tree is frost damaged? Well, the first thing to do is wait. I've already waited a week or so. I guess it's been a little over a week since that frost, just to see for sure what's really alive and what's really dead. And there's even a couple spots on the tree now that I want to wait a little longer before I try to address them or prune them off. Especially, there may be some tips of branches that have died, but the rest of the branch is viable. And the only way to know that for sure is you can check like I did by looking under the bark, and I certainly will do that, but also just wait a little bit and see where the branch is growing. But you do want to cut those bits off. So once you're sure what's alive and what's dead, the next step is to go in and prune away the dead growth, because if you don't, that's just going to invite in disease and pests to come in and cause all sorts of problems for the tree. So the place I'm going to start is that one whole dead frost damaged branch. That's the first thing I'm going to prune. Okay, so here's my dead branch. Luckily I was already debating pruning this one because it's growing up basically straight into the center of the tree, and I sort of want to encourage the whole tree to open up a little bit more. So even though it's taking away a big chunk of the tree, it's probably not a bad thing that I'm getting rid of it. So I've got my sanitized loppers here. This is a big thick branch, and I'm basically just going to cut it as low as I can to the ground. Another problem that I see is that this whole branch, another big scaffold branch right from the bottom, appears at first glance to be dead. There's nothing growing on it right now. But when I look a little closer, and I'll bring you in closer, I do see some signs of buds starting to grow and potentially leaf out. And it's enough that it makes me pause and say I'm going to wait another week or so and see if these do actually leaf out, because I don't want to accidentally get rid of a whole branch that might still have some life in it that I can use to reshape this tree and hopefully get it to where it can fruit a little bit sooner. I have to ask myself, could I have done anything to prevent this? And I think the answer is yes and no. No, because we can't control Mother Nature. There's only so many things that you can do. And if a frost is coming and the tree is budding out, there's really not a whole lot you can do when the tree is this big. If it was a really small tree, if I just planted it, I could cover it, I could protect it in some other way. The tree is mulched. That's another good thing to do to protect from frost, just to help insulate the roots, but that is the case. And the tree is healthy overall, which means it did its best to protect itself. And I'm seeing signs of that. There's already new growth coming out of the bottom. And if I decide I need to, I can keep one of these new shoots and let it grow up to become a whole other scaffold branch. I'm not sure I need to do that yet, but it's just good to see that pomegranate trees and a lot of fruit trees really are resilient if they're healthy. Now, something I think I could have done, which I definitely will from here on out over the winter, is remember that frost damage that was on the bark of that one branch? Well, something that you can do to prevent that is paint the branch with either a diluted white latex paint, so just dilute it 50% with water, or you can use a product like this one. This is Ivy Organics 3-in-1 Plant Guard, and it's this sort of paint, for lack of a better word, that is reflective. It's white and it's going to help reflect the sunlight, and it's also going to help protect against certain pests and critters and diseases. So that's what I really like to use. And I have used it on other fruit trees, but for some reason I skipped this one. But there's actually one more thing I did, or really two more things, that even though I had no idea this was going to happen, it really makes me happy and gives me a lot of hope. Here we go. A whole bunch of brand new baby pomegranate trees. So I propagated my pomegranate tree, and I did it super simply when I pruned the tree this last fall before it went dormant. I was just taking away some of the extra growth around the base of the tree. Basically, just stuck them in some rooting powder and into some dirt and left them alone, kept it moist all winter, and here we go. I have a whole bunch of new pomegranate plants. So this gives me a lot of hope, makes me really excited to grow even more pomegranate trees and hopefully get even more fruit in the future. Now, as far as where I'm going to put all these trees, that is a whole other problem. The other thing I did last fall was plant a second pomegranate tree. The big one over there is a wonderful pomegranate, and this one is a Texas red pomegranate. I wanted to have a second tree so that when they started flowering and fruiting, although most pomegranate trees are self-fruitful, you're always going to see a better, more reliable harvest if you have more than one tree so they can cross-pollinate. I also just think they're really beautiful landscape plants, even when they're not flowering and fruiting, because they just have a really great form. The foliage is pretty. The new growth, as you can see here, is sort of this pretty orangey red, and they have very few pest problems, and they're really easy to maintain. And then to top it off, once they begin flowering, the flowers are these beautiful red trumpet flowers, and the fruit, of course, looks like gorgeous red Christmas ornament globes all over it. Every time you plant a new fruit tree, it's an investment. It's looking ahead to the future, and it admittedly takes a lot of work, especially the first few years, to make sure that the tree gets well established, has a good root system, and is strong and healthy enough to withstand the natural things that will happen, such as frost damage. Over the next few weeks, I'll be watching for more of those signs of dead growth that I need to trim away, but I'll also be watching for signs of new growth and signs that the tree is recovering. And if you've ever had frost surprise your fruit trees, let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear some of your tips for what you did after the fact, as well as how best you found to prevent frost damage on your fruit trees. But to me, the really cool thing is seeing how resilient these trees are. And if I've done my job in, making the growing environment as happy and healthy as possible so that the tree is strong, you can see just how little intervention you really need to do. And the tree is able to protect and do most of the recovery on its own with as little intervention as possible from me. So thanks so much for watching this video. Good luck if you're dealing with frost issues with your fruit trees, and I'll see you in the next one.